Genesis chapter 37, talking about the patriarchs, Jacob's favoritism, and Joseph's slavery. There at the top on page 28, we've got a little bit of background that Leah or Jacob had fled to his mother's family's home and eventually married two wives who were sisters. He loved Rachel but despised Leah. God saw Leah's grief and gave her many children. Rachel had very few. As a result, Jacob showed favoritism to the children Rachel had, named Joseph and Benjamin, which caused more than its fair share of trouble. We'll be in Genesis chapter 37. All right. And we will read Genesis 37, verses 1 through 36. Good. Jacob lived in the land where his father had resided as an alien, that is, in the land of Canaan. This is the account about the development of the family of Jacob. When Joseph was 17 years old, he was tending the flock with his brothers. He was just a boy compared to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. Joseph brought a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his other sons because he was the son born in his old age, and he made him a special robe. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him in a friendly way. Once Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, so they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Please listen to this dream that I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, and suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "So will you really reign over us? Will you really have dominion over us?" They hated him all the more because of his dreams and what he said. Then he had another dream and told it to his brothers. He said, "Listen, I had another dream. This is what I saw. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me." He told it to his father and to his brothers. His father rebuked him and said, "What kind of dream is this that you have dreamed? Will I and your mother and your brothers really come and bow down to the ground in front of you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept what he had said in mind. His brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, "Aren't your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Go, I will send you to them." Joseph said to him, "Yes, I will do it." Israel said to him, "Please go and see whether everything is going well with your brothers and with the flock. Then bring me word again." So he sent him off from the valley at Hebron, and he arrived at Shechem. A man met him as he was wandering in the countryside. The man asked him, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I am looking for my brothers. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." The man said, "They have left here. I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him in the distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill them. They conspired against him to kill him. They said to each other, "Look, here comes this master of dreams. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns, and we will say, 'A wild animal has devoured him.' Then we will see what will become of his dreams." Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands. He said, "Let's not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this cistern that is in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him." He said this so that he could rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father. And so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the special robe he was wearing. Then they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. They sat down to eat bread, and they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels loaded with spices, balms, and myrrh, which they were going to deliver to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there in killing our brother and concealing his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, since he is our brother, our own flesh." His brothers listened to him. As the Midianites who were merchants were passing by, the brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. They brought Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern, he saw that Joseph was not in the cistern, so he tore his clothing. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is no longer here, and as for me, where will I go now?" Then they took Joseph's robe, killed a male goat, and dipped the robe in the goat's blood. Then they took the special robe and they brought it to their father, and they said, "We found this. Examine it now and see whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Without a doubt, Joseph has been torn to pieces." Jacob tore his clothing, put sackcloth around his waist, and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Excuse me. He said, "No, I will mourn for my son until I go down to the grave." So his father wept for him. In Egypt, the Midianites sold him to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, who was the captain of the guard. All right. Any questions? Pretty straightforward. There's a little bit in verse like 25 and verse 28 where we kind of go back and forth between calling them Ishmaelites and Midianites. The Ishmaelites were the descendants of Ishmael. That was the child that Abraham had with Hagar. And then the Midianites were descendants of Abraham's second wife, Keturah. So after Sarah passed away, then he married again, and the Midianites were descended from them. I just learned that about 3 weeks ago, so figured it'd be worth sharing. All right, so far so good. The 2 bullet points in summary: that Jacob looked with great favor on Joseph and treated him better than his other sons, and jealousy led Joseph's brothers to do the unthinkable, first leaving him to die and then selling him into slavery. So a cistern was a giant hole in the ground that they lined with clay to catch the rain water, and then they would be able to cover it up and keep it from evaporating, so that they had rain like in the early spring and then later in the fall. But for most of the summertime, it was pretty dry. And so if they were able to keep that rainwater in a cistern for a while, then they would be able to water their flocks through the summertime. Number 1, like father, and mother, like son. In what way did Jacob make the same mistake in raising his children that his parents Isaac and Rebekah had? Particularly verse 3. Yeah.
He had favorites.
Yeah. And he was playing favorites, and he demonstrated some favoritism. And part of that goes back to how Jacob had been tricked by Laban. But he could have, if the fact that he didn't straighten that out and correct it when he was tricked, didn't really bode well for him. And I think the other thing is that there are days when you might be on a better relationship or better terms with somebody in your household. Maybe somebody just woke up on the wrong side of the bed, and you're like, oh, he's having a hard day, so I'll hang out with that other sibling. But generally speaking, as a parent, you don't. That just changes. You don't play favorites, and Jacob does that again here, same as Isaac and Rebekah. Number 2, talked about Joseph's dreams. What did his dreams seem to indicate would happen in the future? Do you remember what the dreams are? What was one of them?
The one dream was where his sheep stood up on 2 hooves, and then all of his brothers' sheep bowed down to his sheep.
Yeah, we're talking about sheaves of grain. So they would go out and they would harvest the grain, and then they tie it into big bundles that they could stand up for it to dry. And Joseph would collect his and tie his up, and then the brothers and all of their sheaves of grain would come down and bow down before his. Well, that's a little weird. What about the other one? Do you remember what the other one was?
It was the stars and the moon bowing down to
Yeah, and the sun, moon, and 11 stars coming and bowing down. And that kind of has a pretty strong connotation. I mean, Joseph sounds like a little bit of a troublemaker at this age. You're thinking like maybe high school, teenage years, perhaps. But he brings out these dreams to these brothers who already don't think very highly of him. And so number two, what did his dreams seem to indicate would happen in the future? So his sheaf is standing up and the others are bowing down. And how did they interpret that? However you want to put it. That Joseph would be in charge, or that the other brothers would bow down to Joseph. Yeah. Which is they already don't like him, and they already think that he thinks a little bit too highly of himself. And then he tells them this. The ironic thing is that him telling them about his dreams results in them selling him into slavery, and then God bringing these dreams to pass about 25 years later. Number three, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were taking care of the flocks far away. When his brothers saw Joseph coming, what plot did they devise? There was kind of like two or three things that they went through before they arrived at a final solution, which is going to tie in with number four. So the first idea that comes to mind when they see Joseph coming from a long way off, yeah.
Was to throw him in the, I don't know how to say it, but like the
Cistern?
cistern.
Yeah. And then they also had this other idea that they're gonna just pretend that some wild animal got to him, and maybe we can hide his body. Like that's pretty serious. So they have a couple different plots to kill him, either by just leaving him where he can't help himself, or something else. Reuben has another idea, which is there in verse 22. We have a volunteer to reread verse 22 for us from chapter 37.
Said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this cistern, take his life. Let him throw him into the cistern that is in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. He said this so that he could rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father.
All right, excellent. So Reuben's idea, well, let's just throw him in the cistern for a while, and he'll learn his lesson. And his thinking is that he can rescue him and send him back home, and then get things straightened out eventually. But there's some pretty obvious problems already here in the family of Jacob. We heard in this chapter that Jacob also had two other wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. So in a sense, he was kind of married to four different women at the same time, which wasn't ever part of God's plan for marriage. But we also see in scripture here that God certainly records exactly what goes wrong when that sort of, disobeying God's blueprint for marriage really is something that Jacob did. Number 5, the arrival of the Ishmaelites, descended from Abraham's illegitimate son Ishmael, when he and Sarah did not trust God to deliver them son. The arrival of the Ishmaelites presented a different opportunity. Judah came up with a new plan. Rather than killing him or leaving him for dead in the dried cistern, what did they plan to do with Joseph? Yeah. Why would it be up to us to get rid of him, to dispose of him, when we can make a few bucks off of him? We can sell him into slavery. And that's going to be noteworthy in another lesson or so, when Judah is the one who comes up with this new plan to sell him into slavery. And eventually, when the brothers bow down before Joseph again, that second time that they come to Egypt, Judah is going to be the one to volunteer to stay behind, so that his brother Simeon would be released from prison. Number 6, Judah said that selling Joseph into slavery was morally better than killing him. Was it? This is kind of a thinking question. They already had the option of just leaving him to die in the cistern. They've already thought through the option of killing him and, providing some evidence that he had been eaten by some sort of wild animal. And now Judah says, let's just sell him into slavery, because then, it's not really on us. Is it a better thing, or is there a degree of difference here? Was slavery a less sinful option than killing him?
I guess it might not be, like, it's obviously not good morally, but it might not be as bad. It's still alive.
All right.
But it's also not good at the same time.
Yeah, this isn't a good thing. That's for certain. But Elizabeth, anything else?
You just I feel like selling him, you'd make money off of it, but you might not ever get him back.
Yeah.
But if you kill him, then that's your fault. But if you sell him to slavery, that's also your fault.
All right. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on there. That AJ highlighted that, killing him is a bad thing to do. It's completely unjustified and sinful. Selling him into slavery is a bad thing to do, because you don't know what's going to happen to him. Is he going to be put to hard labor, or is he going to be, serving as a slave in the plush palace of a king somewhere? And also, which is worse, to say that we're going to kill him so that because of our anger against him, or to say that we're going to, make $20-$30, maybe $200 in today's dollars off of him when we sell him into slavery. There's got to be something to be said for compromising your integrity just to make a few extra dollars. Like, that's not a good thing either. Then you're just purely motivated by greed. I think, morally, it's still a sin either way. And knowing what we know of slavery, in ancient times or in more modern times, it's never a good thing. And this shouldn't have been an option at all. You think of the fifth commandment, that you shall not murder. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, that we do not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but rather help him, be a friend to him in every bodily need. Well, they weren't doing that at all. They were hurting or harming him, even if they weren't actually killing him at that point. Yeah.
If you kill him, you're probably going to eventually find the body.
Yeah. That's the thing. Like, the conscience is always going to be there. And that's the part that bothers me at the end of this chapter, is they come back with his coat and they've covered it in the blood of a goat, and they've got this, new set of, $20 bills in each of their pockets. And here's Jacob, who is tearing his hair out and going on and mourning and grieving for months on end. And they don't say anything. Like, whoa, this isn't, yeah. Number 7, how did they cover up what they had done? Looking especially at verse 31.
They killed a male goat and dipped the robe in the goat's blood.
Yeah. And there are, at this time, there are a number of lions, a lot of lions in that area. You think of the African lion, And there was a slightly larger lion that lived in the Mediterranean, so all of Canaan around to modern day Turkey and even Greece. And that lion would go extinct in the early like 200s or 300s. But it's still there, and it's actually larger than the African lion. So it's completely plausible, I guess. So looking back at this section of chapter 37, I'll give you a couple minutes to highlight, look for 2 or 3 major problems, and also 2 or 3 things that they could have done differently. I'll give you a couple minutes and I'll jot that down here. Thinking about 2 or 3 major problems that we saw in this chapter, and 2 to 3 things they could have done differently. Yeah, he doesn't have an Apple AirTag in his pocket.
We killed it. Are goats' bloods different than our blood? Or do they look the same?
It looks the same.
Is there a reason it's always a goat's blood? Like Abraham stuff.
Mhm.
They also had like the goat. And then for this, they also
I think the only thing here is they had a lot of goats because they were watching sheep and goats. They had it available. Other major problems. There are a few. Yeah. That's a very good starting point.
The fact that if I went out and killed AJ, I'd probably be happy for like 2 hours.
Maybe we won't dwell on this chapter too long. No.
2 hours maybe.
Then I would worry about you, Elizabeth.
do this.
What about in this chapter? In this chapter.
In the chapter.
Yeah, so we talked about number one, the fact that this sin in their heart of wanting to kill him results in the sin of action of plotting to kill him, then selling him into slavery, then lying to their father and continuing the deception for almost 25 to 30 years. And the way it worked out, they probably didn't have to admit anything, because they could have been just like, well, we found his coat, he disappeared, and I guess the Ishmaelites must have found him and nursed him back to health. I think that's a major problem, that nobody in this chapter is saying, not just we shouldn't have this attitude toward our brother, but we need to stop and repent of this sinful attitude before it gets worse. It's the exact same thing we had back in Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel, where God said to Cain, sin is crouching at your door and you must master it. And if you don't, then sin is going to overtake your life. Any other problems in this chapter?
Also that Jacob had favorites, like favorite sons.
Yeah, that Jacob had favorite sons and favorite wives. Time out. That's a very, very bad way of going about this. I mean, I've got a favorite wife, but she's my only wife, right? And that Jacob then plays favorites, and he doesn't just have favorites and think to himself, that child really is well organized and he's going somewhere, and that child, we need to help along a little bit more. But he doesn't see the value, like the equal value in all of his kids. But he instead like dotes on Joseph and Benjamin, and he gives Joseph this beautiful coat that the others, that he didn't do for the others. And Reuben is probably, I have to check. I think Reuben is at least 20 or maybe even 30 years older than than Joseph. So if you think Joseph is, 12, between 12 and 17 in this chapter, then Reuben is between 32 and 50. Like, he's a grown man and he certainly knows better. Anything else? Any other major problems in this chapter?
Yes, if there's that huge age gap between Joseph and like all the other brothers, you probably shouldn't be telling them that he's gonna like move. He's like trees there.
Yeah, there is that. Like, here's Joseph, who's a little bit younger than the others, and it's like, if they already don't like you and things aren't going well in the household, then don't go bragging about this dream that you had. Just keep it to yourself for a while. It does seem like there's a little bit of arrogance that we see in Joseph, and over the next years of his life, that definitely gets changed. What about any other things that they could have done differently?
Did not try to kill their brother.
All right. Yeah, let's start with the baseline. Don't kill your brother. And then after that, let's go with don't sell him into slavery. And then after that, then you can start to get to the real problem of, Dad, why are you treating him so differently than the rest of us? Because I think that's one theme that we see from looking at the Old Testament, is that when sin is just left to sit for a while instead of being addressed, then it just continues to grow and get worse. Other things that they could have done differently. This lesson's got a lot in it. Don't worry, chapter 39 is worse. All right, that gets us into chapter 39. Joseph's service in Potiphar's house, and then Joseph's imprisonment. Let's see, there it is. All right, Genesis chapter 39. Reads like this. When Joseph was brought down to Egypt, Potiphar the Egyptian, who was an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard, bought Joseph from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down to Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became successful. He served in the house of his master, the Egyptian. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything that he touched a success. Joseph found favor in his sight. Joseph served him, and he made Joseph manager of his household. He put Joseph in charge of everything. From the time that Potiphar made him manager of his household, in charge of everything that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's household for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord rested on everything that he had, both in the house and in the fields. So he left Joseph in charge of everything that he had. Almost like we've said that 3 times already. But he's really driving home that point, I guess, that he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Joseph was well built and handsome. Sometime after this, his master's wife had her eye on Joseph, and she said, "Come, lie down with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not concern himself with anything that has been entrusted to me in the house. He has put me in charge of everything that he has. He has no one in this house greater than I am, and he has not withheld anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a great evil and sin against God?" She kept speaking to Joseph day after day, but he would not listen to her. He would not lie down beside her or even be with her. But one day when he went into the house to do his work, none of the men of the household were there inside the house. She caught him by his garment and said, "Come, lie down with me." He left behind his garment in her hand and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had run outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "Look, my husband has brought a Hebrew man in to put us to shame. He came in to lie down with me, but I screamed loudly. When he heard me scream, he left behind his garment with me and ran outside." She kept his garment beside her until his master came home. This is what she told him. The Hebrew servant whom you have brought to us came to me to put me to shame and said to me, let me lie down with you. And looked, when I screamed and cried out, he left behind his garment with me and ran outside. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, this is what your servant did to me, he became very angry. Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was kept in prison there. But the Lord was with Joseph. He showed mercy to him and gave him favor in the sight of the warden of the prison. The warden of the prison made Joseph responsible for all the prisoners who were in the prison. Joseph was responsible for whatever they did there. The warden of the prison did not pay attention to anything that was under his authority, because the Lord was with Joseph, and the Lord made everything that he did succeed. All right. Any questions? We will have a similar one here. This one's a little bit shorter, but looking for, I like 2 to 3, because then everybody's like, oh, I can do 2, but then here's a third. 2 to 3 things Joseph did well in this chapter. All right. So looking back at this chapter, there's a lot here. Let's try to find 2 or even 3 things that Joseph did well. This is still fairly early in Joseph having his attitude changed and corrected. All right. Who wants to start us off?
Well, he manages.
All right. Yeah, he manages the house very well. And when Moses is writing, this chapter, he says it like 3 times in the space of 5 verses, that Joseph managed everything in the household, that Joseph managed all the things in the field and in the home. So he's also overseeing probably a few other servants and slaves as well. Anything else? Yeah.
Well, this isn't what he did well when he got stuck in jail.
Yeah, that's at the very end. He's wrongfully accused, and then he ends up in jail, and he ends up with the result that he gets to oversee a portion of the prison as well. So there's some learning. There's some God is with him there.
I think he, with him saying no to the wife, keeps his promise to God. I feel like he's honest that way.
Definitely.
As far as not.
And I love the way he phrased it. How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? That it's not just a matter of, you're the wife of the man who is my employer. So it's not just some workplace ethics, but it's this greater image of my responsibility to God. I think the other one that might be in connection with that is that Joseph, that Potiphar's wife has been bothering Joseph for a while. And at least the impression that I get is that Joseph has been making an effort to avoid being with her, and that if he's ever in the same, dusting all the furniture in the house, then there are other people in the house with him, to kind of preserve his own reputation as well, so that other people would be able to say what had happened or what didn't happen. But that's not fail safe. All right. So in summary, on page 29, those 2 bullet points under Genesis 39 says that the first one, not long after Joseph arrived in Egypt, he was sold to a man named Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife tried to entrap Joseph, and he ended up in prison. So number 8, who was Potiphar? the man to whom Joseph was sold. Looking back especially at verse 1.
He was an Egyptian officer.
Mhm.
And was the captain of the guard for the Pharaoh.
Excellent. So yeah, he's one of Pharaoh's officials. He's the captain of the guard for the Pharaoh. So he's, if you think of it, maybe a good example would be like this probably isn't a good example, but in other countries we have something called an embassy, which is just a gigantic office building where American citizens can live and work for the government. And then at every embassy, there's also a group of Marines that protect the embassy. And then, he'd be like the guy in charge of the Marines protecting the embassy, or maybe like the guy in charge of the Secret Service, something like that. Number 9, what did God do for Joseph while he was a slave in Potiphar's house? Especially verse 2.
Helped him become like.
Yeah. Helped him. He blessed Joseph's work so that everything Joseph did had prospered. How about number 10? Because God was with him, what did Potiphar do for Joseph? Yeah, kept promoting him, put him in charge of the whole household, and then not just, the day-to-day activities, but that includes like the farmland and the other servants who are employed there. Servants or slaves. Number 11, Potiphar's wife, come lie down with me is what she says a few times in the chapter, which is the newer translation. And, however you put it, it's not good because she's married to Potiphar. It's really that simple. And number 12, it kind of touches on what we had talked about a little bit previously, that Joseph's number 1 concern wasn't about getting in trouble with Potiphar, but what was his main concern? If you look especially at verse 9.
Like breaking God's trust.
Yeah. How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? That he wasn't even concerned about the consequences for his work, or the consequences right here and now, but even greater, how could I not live up to what God wants me to be? How could I sin against God like that? I do have to say, watching you write, I've never seen anybody hold a pencil like that. I don't spend a lot of time because I don't do a whole lot of teaching where we do a whole lot of writing, but yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I do like this, but my writing is about the same as like a doctor writing a prescription, because most of my writing's like this now.
Go back to this.
Okay, good.
Go back to this.
There is. That brings us up, I think, through the end of this month. Yeah. Just want you to feel at home here, AJ, that you get made fun of both at home and at church. I'm not teased. Like this is, that looks about your grade level.
Yeah, we're the only homeroom that doesn't do cursive except for the ELA homeroom, which is good. My teacher is math.
Huh.
Oh. The science is so interesting. Packets.
We never did work.
Here's a jacket.
We'll get there.
Everyone was supposed to sit there and read.
Yeah.
Everyone just talks or plays my Chromebook. We're not supposed to go on our Chromebooks. So
How about number 13? The answer is Chromebook.
yeah.
Answer is Jesus, forgiveness, sin, Chromebook, in that order. Number 13, sleeping with Potiphar's wife would have been wrong. What limits did God put on sexual intimacy between people? Looking at the sixth commandment is in the blue box there on page 30. Reads like this. You shall not commit adultery. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, that we lead a pure and decent life in words and actions, and that husband and wife love and honor each other. This is aside from this one, commandment number 6 and commandment number 1 are the two commandments where the explanation just says this is what we should do. Like we should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. That's the first one. Or that we should lead a pure and decent life in words and actions. What are the limits? And this is probably different than you either have encountered and certainly different from what you will encounter in the rest of your life, I'm sure. Yeah.
What's adultery?
Adultery. That's a fantastic question. It's been a while since I've taught the sixth commandment. All right. So adultery just means that a husband and wife promise to be faithful to each other. And that the lack of faithfulness to each other is called adultery. Sometimes it's a physical thing. It can be other things as well. But basically, when a husband and wife get married, they promise on oath to be faithful to their spouse. All right. So sleeping with Potiphar's wife would have been wrong. And so the main thing that we see here, at least reflected in this account, that this sexual relationship is only for a husband and wife, the spouse and spouses who are married to each other. And that is in line with God's design for marriage, that it is between one man and one woman, committed together freely for life. And any other relationship is not a relationship where the godly use of the body is going to be exercised properly. In other words, that we want to see what God says first about marriage if we want to see what God has to say about how we are to conduct ourselves.
I look out the window and I can see two lights and darkness.
Yeah.
I can see.
Yep. And every now and then you'll see a car drive in and turn around.
Yeah.
And a new sign that has time and temperature on it. Eventually we can put other things on it too. Yeah. Number 14. After Potiphar's wife grabbed him, Joseph ran out of the house, leaving his cloak behind. What lie did she tell Potiphar to get Joseph in trouble?
That like he left her and just left his like garment and clothes.
Yeah. She basically turned it all around and said that even though she was the one who was pestering him to commit this sin with her, when she grabs his cloak and now she's like, well, how am I going to make my husband believe me? She turns it around and says that he was the one who was trying to hurt me or harm me or anything like that. And then she screamed and then he left his cloak behind. So if you see on page 29, Joseph is the one with the purple hat. And that's kind of a representation of the tunic, which is the regular clothing. That's the purple. And then the cloak goes over the top of that.
What does it look like they're wearing bald caps? Like when this is made of bald cap.
That's a brimless cap.
Oh.
I don't know if that's entirely accurate to Egyptian custom at the time. I'd have to look that up. It was something that our publishing house came up with probably 15 years ago. So that's a good question. I don't have an answer for you. How about number 15? A slave assaulting the wife of his master would have been a crime punishable by death. But Potiphar didn't have Joseph killed. In fact, he put him in a prison that was under his supervision. Why do you think Potiphar might have done that? Because Potiphar is the captain of the guard, which also oversees this is the Pharaoh's prison where the special prisoners are put. Why do you think Potiphar said, Joseph, this is what my wife said, and I could have you killed, but instead I'm going to put you in prison. Why?
Because one of the commandments is you shall not murder, and now you're going against the commandment.
All right, that's common to think that. At the time, as the counterpoint to kind of balance that out, at the time they don't have the commandments in written form yet. That's not going to be for another 400 years. And secondly, that Potiphar is an Egyptian, so he, we don't know if he's a believer or not, but he doesn't, wouldn't feel compelled to obey the commandments. So this could be just something that the courts decide that is the sentence for that particular crime. What else?
Maybe if he thought that since Joseph had God on his side, if he killed Joseph, God would be against him.
All right, maybe, yeah, I think that's a good explanation too. That maybe there is an element of superstition that God, or as Potiphar might put it, the gods are certainly blessing his work. And if I kill him, then maybe the gods will be angry with me. I think that's very plausible. Another possibility, maybe he didn't believe his wife. Maybe there were some discrepancies in the story, and thought that Joseph was innocent in some way. Or at the very least, he saw that Joseph was a valuable slave and would rather just put him in prison than to have him killed. So this is like time number 2 or 3 when Joseph misses out on, when Joseph evades death by God's grace. Family doesn't make fun of you for the way you're right, do they? Okay. Well, but
I just kind of teach you. In preschool, they tried to give him one of those triangle pencils.
that's funny.
This is more.
That's right. My mom's been.
I had good handwriting.
Oh yeah. So what happened? But That's all right. My mom's been making fun of the way I write for like 30 years, literally. All right. How about number 16? As had been in the case in Potiphar's home, even in prison, what did God do for Joseph? Looking especially at chapter 39, verses 21, 22, and 23. End of the chapter for us.
Made him successful again.
All right. Yeah.
And he was promoted. Given different jobs,
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of all those things, kind of cascading, that God blessed his work, made it successful. He was promoted, that even in the prison, there's some organization and he has some specific responsibilities. And Joseph has been given the task of some more oversight. this might come in handy, practically speaking, a little bit of, household management and then management in the prison might come in handy during the time of the famine when he has to manage the entire nation of Egypt. All right, we will be in 1 Corinthians chapter 10.
There's no other questions, so I'm just not gonna.
No way.
Yeah, I'm not gonna hold my spot because there's no point.
Oh man.
What page is it on?
That's daring. So you're thinking New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1, 2 Peter, 1, 2, 3 John, Jude, Revelation.
Goes from like this. So I gotta get to that page like 53. There. Like there to here.
Yeah.
Actually, I found the page we were on.
Oh, good. We'll look at, I guess, verses 12 and 13 of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Verses 12 and 13 reads like this. So let him who thinks he stands be careful that he does not fall. No testing has overtaken you except ordinary testing, but God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tested beyond your ability, but when he tests you, he will also bring about the outcome that you are able to bear it. All right, so this talks specifically about temptation and God's promise of promise during temptation, I guess here in verse 13. Looking at this, what's something that we see about God's promise during temptation? Particularly the last sentence of verse 13.
That you will try not to make it so difficult that you can't succeed.
Yeah. And so, like the number one thing is that he's not going to make it, God's not going to set you up for failure. He's going to make it that you're not set up for failure. That there will be the possibility and the possibility to overcome that temptation. I think that's it's a fairly strong promise. And then that's also what the Lord's Prayer talks about here at the bottom of page 30 that we'll look at in just a moment. So bottom of page 30, in the blue box, we've got two petitions from the Lord's Prayer, what we call the sixth petition and then the seventh petition. The sixth petition, lead us not into temptation. What does this mean? God surely tempts no one to sin, but we pray in this petition that God would guard and keep us, so that the devil, the world, and our flesh may not deceive us or lead us into false belief, despair, and other great and shameful sins. And though we are tempted by them, we pray that we may overcome and win the victory. And the seventh petition, but deliver us from evil. What does this mean? In conclusion, we pray in this petition that our Father in heaven would deliver us from every evil that threatens body and soul, property and reputation. And finally, when our last hour comes, grant us a blessed end and graciously take us from this world of sorrow to himself in heaven. So looking at those in the context of temptation, or thinking back to what we looked at with Joseph in Potiphar's house, is the specific application here. That this is something that you and I pray regularly, that we would pray that God would keep us away from temptation and keep temptation away from us. And that also, even when something evil happened, and so evil, you're thinking of something that's sinful, morally wrong. And the evil there was that Potiphar's wife had lied about Joseph and had him thrown into prison. And just as the brothers had lied about Joseph and then sold him into slavery, there was a lot of evil that happened against Joseph early in his life that we see in tonight's lesson. But our prayer, but deliver us from evil, is that our Father in heaven would deliver us from every evil that threatens body and soul, property and reputation, and that eventually he will bring us out of this world of sorrow to himself in heaven. Excuse me. So I think together with that, even when that evil happened in Joseph's life, there's a couple of things that we can take from that. First of all, is that God would eventually use that evil for Joseph's good and for the good of accomplishing his own plan of salvation and keeping the nation of Israel safe there in the land of Egypt. And that secondly, you and I don't have a specific promise of God that he is going to keep evil out of our lives, or that he is going to make sure that everything in life ends out fairly and exactly justly the way that it should. It still happens that people are sent to prison when they didn't actually do the crime. That's an evil thing that happens. It still happens that people might be victims of crime, like one man that I had ministered to once, who's now in heaven, but he ended up being scammed for like a third of all of his life savings, and that was an evil thing. He couldn't get it back, and he couldn't correct it. But the promise from God is that in the end, eventually we will have that evil corrected when God brings us to heaven, and that we might even see how that difficult circumstance would have been a benefit to us. Normally, we don't see that until after the fact, thinking back. That's kind of what Joseph is going to be doing in another 10 chapters from now, in like chapter 49. But that is, I think, this lesson in particular can be challenging for a number of reasons. You've got the siblings talking about killing Joseph. You've got Joseph being thrown into prison, the accusations from Potiphar's wife. But I think there's also some good applications and lessons that we can learn from the lesson tonight. Any other questions or comments, especially on Genesis 37 and the selling him into slavery, or Genesis 39 and Joseph's service in Potiphar's home? Yeah.
So I guess why is it always referred to as a world of sorrow? Like at the what does this mean at the very bottom?
Mm-hmm.
So why is it referred to the earth as a world of sorrow?
Yeah, I think the way I usually like my phrase isn't a world of sorrow, but I refer to it as a world of sin and death and pain. And I think when we talk about it as a world of sorrow, it's easy to see the counterpart, that there are happy times, there's good relationships with people, there are joyful moments. But the fact that we call it a world of sorrow, or that we refer to it here, just refers to the fact that in the end, sin or death is going to try to corrupt the joy that we do have in this world, or the joyful relationships that we do have will eventually come to an end. And as joyful as the time may be that we have with somebody, it always ends with sorrow in some way, shape, or form. Like that was one couple that I had buried the man probably 5 months before their 50th wedding anniversary, and they had a wonderful marriage. Like if just still talking to the widow today, a few days ago, just a wonderful marriage. And we both say, her husband had been a wonderful man. And I think talking about it as a world of sorrow, I think the other aspect of it isn't just that life ends with sorrow, as if to say, well, what's the use? Because the world is always a sad place. But the contrast of a heaven where there is no sorrow and where God promises to wipe every tear from our eyes. I don't know if that I touched on a little bit. We'll come around to that again. And I think it, after looking at that a little bit more, and as we go through this study or encounter different things in life, It kind of makes sense after a while, even though there are many happy moments and many joyful times throughout life, that in this world there's still sorrow that comes along, and it's a world of sorrow compared to a heaven of eternal joy. I think that's probably the memory hook. Anything else?